My name is Marissa Evangelista, and I am an MFA intern, and I will be your co-host for tonight's Wil Talk with Artists. Our digital discussion tonight is with digital mixed media, Wen Redmond. Wen merges digital processes, fabric painting, photography, collage, and surface design to create beautiful works of art that have an innovative edge. She has several signature techniques, but still continues to explore different digital mixed media possibilities. Wen also published a book called Digital Fiber Art, Combined Photos and Fabric, and another that will be published in the future is Explorations with Collage. Additionally, I would like to introduce the host of our show, Wil Scott. Wil is an art historian with an extensive career as a photographer and the former head of adult programs in the National Gallery of Art. He is uniquely qualified to bridge the gap between artists and the public.
All right, thank you, Marissa, and thanks for being present again tonight to help us. You're doing a wonderful job, and I really feel like I can't screw up the technology too much as long as you're there. And Wen, thank you for agreeing to be interviewed and to talk with us tonight, because as a photographer, I'm really fascinated to learn why you have combined photography and fiber arts. I mean, that never even would have occurred to me, and when I see your work, it looks very complex technically and very compelling. So I want to know why you chose to do that and what you're getting out of that as an artist. But because you did not have an extensive sort of formal art training, you've told me, and I wondered if you would just briefly give a quick sort of biography and how you got to the point where you became a, shall we say, full-time artist, for the lack of a better term.
Oh, well, we're spanning quite a few years in that picture. No pun intended. I was a home economics teacher, and I started out teaching, I went high school, taught high school, taught junior high. I taught early childhood education for a while. My love in home economics was early childhood education, interior design, and consumer education. But I landed a job in high school, and those options weren't available. And I taught a class in junior high. And instead of making aprons, we made soft sculptures. And this is in the mid-70s. So each of the children made their own patterns, and they sewed their soft sculptures. And we had one of those ceilings where you could push up the tiles, and we tied them up on the ceiling. And then the cooking class invited the principal in for tea. And he walked in and his jaw just dropped because all the soft stuff, I mean, there was pencils and initials and all kinds of things. And it was really a lot of fun. And so I think I've always been, well, like when I was going to college, there were the polyester home economics students and then the renegades. And I think I've always been one of those renegades because I took home economics and made it, I thought, more interesting than and then I found a bag of materials when I took another job, and I was just playing around sewing these materials together, and then I lined them with felt and I top stitched all over them and made pillows. And then I met my husband and I moved to New Hampshire, and eventually I joined a quilt guild called the Cochico Quilt Guild in Dover, New Hampshire. And I learned everything I had been doing was wrong. So, I had to, I learned all the rules, all the quilting rules, because I was very interested in antique quilts at the time as well, and have made a couple of those. And I quickly got bored. I'm sorry. I love them, appreciate them, but not for me. And I started making folk quilts that were traditionally kind of constructed. And I was invited to the Paducah Museum at the time. I forget the name of it, but I think it's now the National Museum of Quilts or something such like that.
Is that Paducah, Kentucky?
Yeah. But I didn't send it to them because it was my son's baby quilt. So I kept it. But but it was kind of a tickle. And that was sort of one of the first times I was approached.
So it's the fiber arts that came first, and really you've been involved with fiber arts for the longest amount of time. Before I ask a question related to that, I just want to say how interesting it is to me that this is a pattern, what you've described, starting in the classroom, perhaps in a teaching environment, and having your hands-on materials and getting young people to get their hands-on materials. And then that turns into something much more substantial for you. A number of our artists who are working in 3 dimensions or with materials have had a similar path. And fortunately, your path through high school is not the same as mine. I had to take an art class, and I'm not proud of it, but it seems kind of funny. I used to throw those rubber erasers at my art teacher when he turned to draw on his sketch pad. And so how I became a photographer or an art historian is somehow even mystifying to me. I'm glad your path was smoother. When did and how did photography get involved in this? Because what you're doing with fabric is substantial.
Right. Well, that was much later. I just continued to evolve in the fiber related world. I started getting into what I called free applique, where I didn't turn under the edges and I just kind of applied fabric. And no one was doing that at the time. And I thought, oh, I can't do that. That's not, copacetic. So I didn't continue. But it was, and now I encourage people to listen to their voices as they're inspired to do things, because I have turned away from other things. But I've always also parallelly been interested in photography. And I used to have a single lens reflex camera that you wind the film in, all of that. And I used to love taking photographs, but they were 2 separate paths.
Yes.
Fast forward to the computer age, around 2000, whatever, I got a computer and my son taught me how to use it. And then I was able to print. And when I was printing things, I'm like, oh, I could maybe print my photographs on this. Because all the time that I had been working with just fiber, I was experimenting with different ways to get my photographs onto fabric via thermofax silk screens, for instance, which you may or may not know that they're photographs essentially that you burn to a polyester coated screen. And then you can make these very detailed, wonderful photographic screens. And I even had a thermofax screen machine at one time, but then the fan belt stopped or something, and it was spewing smoke, and I'm running down the stairs with this smoking shot machine, stinky. Oh, anyway, and previously I had done Xerox transfers, which were only available at copy shops at the time and so forth. So I've always been wanting to get my photography into
so technology was your doorway or your pathway into doing this. But the art historian in me, as you started to explain these things you were just speaking about, I'm thinking of Andy Warhol and Robert Rauschenberg and all of these people that were really the hot cutting edge things when you and I were college age and shortly after college. Were you aware of those? Were you in any way inspired or encouraged by artists like that?
I have to be frank, I don't have an art background. I didn't go to art school. At one point, I was with a group of people in a art community, and I thought maybe that's what I should do. And the whole majority said, no, just do what you're doing. You're fine. You don't need to do that. But there are aspects like art history that I probably would have benefited from. But I have since discovered Rauschenberg, and he did transfers.
He did all kinds of things. And there was a guy, actually, have you ever heard of a guy, Ted, I think is his first name, but Saff, Haff was his surname, and he used to have a facility that's over near Easton, Maryland. And he was able to provide the technology to do a lot of the kinds of things that it was called SAF Tech. And Rauschenberg, Johns, Liechtenstein, all of these people would go over to Easton, Maryland to do the kind of experimentation that you're talking about doing organically yourself. So I think it's really, to me, it honestly is impressive that you found a pathway that was sort of, you were being a renegade in your fabric or fiber world, but you're in the mainstream actually, contemporaneously with all of these big name people that are in major museums. So that's kind of fascinating to me. Now, so your work is so visually strong, I think, and complex technically, or at least it appears to be to me. Well, why don't we jump ahead, because I know that each one of your pieces that we've selected or you selected for the PowerPoint, there's a lot that we can unpack to help people understand how you do what you do and what the end result is. Okay.
Well, this is a relatively new piece called Drawing the Breath, and it is a manipulated photograph. One of the things I love doing in Photoshop and all the different apps that you can avail yourself of is creating photographs. My favorite subject happens to be trees. I'm a tree lover from way back. I remember when I was 10 years old, I was hugging a tree, screaming at the top of my lungs because all the chainsaws were going. I grew up in a fast growing area in New Jersey, and all these chainsaws were going off. And I said, stop cutting these trees. And I yelled passionately. Just as I started yelling, the chainsaw stopped. So
there you go.
But I was so embarrassed because I didn't know there was such a thing as tree hugging, and that's what I was doing. I was hugging a tree. Anyway, they keep popping up in my work. I do love nature and I love being outside, so it's a natural evolution for me to use photography of the things I love in my work. This particular piece has two layers. It looks sort of out of focus. And the reason for that is the top layer is made of strips of printed silk organza that is inkjet ready to print. And this is the only inkjet prepared fabric that I still use, because to prepare it with digital grounds, which are made, by the way, by inkaid.com, they're wonderful for everything except the organza. The organza loses its transparency, so I still buy the digital grounds. I mean the digital silk organza. Anyway, so that's attached only at the top with brads, and it's attached to a surface that I created out of flashing tape and duct tape. So if you can kind of see on the right side underneath the white area, with some two like gray stripes, and they travel to make the top of the piece darker. That's duct tape. And then there's more on the left. So my thing right now in my digital work is creating the substrates that I print on. Instead of printing on simple white fabric, and there's a host of digital fabrics out there that you can try that are prepared for printing. They're all made by Jacquard, and you can go to inkjet-prepared.com, or Dharma Trading Company also sells them. But
so I'm gonna interrupt you a number of times here, because for a couple of reasons, and one of them is selfish, and that is, as a photographer, the immediate question that's coming to me is, why don't you use metallic paper? I've fallen in love with metallic photo papers, and they produce a very similar optical sensation as this piece. So have you thought about that? And related to that, what kind of printer are you using in your studio? Or do you have to take it out to a specialty print shop?
No. So that's several questions. I print everything on my own, and I've had several different printers. I started out with a relatively small printer. It prints 13 inches wide. It's by Epson. All my printers that I've had successful printing with are Epson. That's not to say that there aren't any, but if you buy a printer, you want to look for a printer, inkjet pigment printer, that is to say, not laser, not a copier, because inks are more water resistant and fade proof. And then the substrate that you print on should have some sort of preparation as well, whether it's commercially prepared fabrics or commercially prepared papers, as you just cited, the metallic papers. I have printed on metallic origami paper as well. But so I'm sort of 2 years into combining fabric and paper. And that's probably why I've never used the metallic paper. But I'm exploring what I can find at hand. And the flashing tape and duct tape are relatively inexpensive, but they are but they are prepared with digital grants by Inkjet. And Inkjet does sell, and I'm not working for them, thank you. They do sell sample packs. So you can buy a sample pack and try a variety of them. And it's just, you just paint them on and allow them to dry, mount your substrate on a carrier sheet if need be, and print. And all of this is outlined in my first book, Digital Fiber, that you can find on Amazon. It's
So just so that I'm clear, and I
Yeah.
hope in the process, the listeners are also clear, you're using a standard photo printer made by Epson, and you're using these materials that you've just described.
Right. And it does void your warranty, by the way. But yeah, so that was my first printer, the 2400. They don't make it anymore because they continue to make new models, sort of like
Yeah.
iPhones and Apple products, because it's planned obsolescence. They want you to buy. But anyway, in the meantime, I had purchased a 24-inch printer from my photographer because I wanted to print big.
Yeah.
So I worked with that for a while and did a number of pieces. And then I realized, much like a piano, printers like to be used.
Yeah.
So if you don't use it on a regular basis, or at least turn it on for a little while, the print heads can dry out, and then you have to clean the head, and that requires ink and so on and so forth. So I ended up selling that one. Then I got a 3880 printer by Epson.
Oh, geez.
17 inches wide. And that was, I really liked it. I really did. But I had 4 printers at that point. And I thought, this is silly. I don't need to have 4 printers. So I didn't want to get rid of my 2400 because that's like my trusty Bernina. It's a workhorse. So I sold my 3880, and I kind of feel regretful about it, but it probably, for now, it's the best thing for me. I also have a regular all-in-one kind of thing for documents. And it has
I do too. I have a inkjet printer, but I also have a laser printer for my photographs. Let me ask you something. This may be a little, I hope you take this in the right way. When I look at this image, I see 2 what could be independent, separate works of art. And one would be a black and white photograph. It would, I think, be sort of a bare tree winter snow scene. And the other would be the colors alone as almost an abstract composition. Are you thinking of that as you're creating, or am I just reading it that way because that's my take, that's my vision of this image?
It is a manipulated piece. So so when I say manipulated piece, what I'm referring to is the photograph itself that I used for this process, for this particular piece. And they're put together from several different photographs. Generally, the color comes from photographs of painted fabric, which I still do because it's a nice studio warm-up kind of thing. Or I'll combine 2 photographs together, 2 images, or I'll create a textured surface and I'll use that to create a photograph in the blend modes via Photoshop, or like I said, all the apps that you can get that have blending capabilities. I often will use, and this is maybe what you're seeing, black and white photographs to blend with my color photographs.
Mhm.
I think the presence of black and white with color provides more contrast and more interest to the finished piece.
Mhm. Yeah, that does help me understand what you're doing, but this is more of a, well, it is a purely subjective question, I guess. Why don't you just paint or just use fabric? I see what you've done with the photograph as a part of this collage or mixed media, but it seems like a layer of technical complexity that produces a beautiful result, but might not be absolutely necessary. So I guess it's a why question. Why do you do it that way?
Necessary because it's a photographic piece. It's not a painted piece.
Mhm.
I can't paint. I'm not a realistic painter. I'm not an artist in that field.
get it.
That's not my field.
Yeah.
Field is fiber. It's merging into mixed media work, and it's rooted in photography.
Yeah. So, okay. So this would go back. Now I'll go back to what my original impression of seeing your work was, that this is a very unique process that you've developed out of experimentation that allows you to express yourself as freely as possible. Is that fair?
That's fair.
Yeah, well, it's a beautiful result. I really am intrigued by this on purely visual terms, but you've got a lot of other good stuff. So let's go to the next image, Marissa.
Here's the image of the layers. And I want to remind you guys that we have about 35 minutes left.
Oh,
And we have, I
geez.
think, 6 more images.
Thank you, Marissa.
This
So
note-
go back to that. And when you want to just quickly explain to us what you're doing. I see your hand and I can see the film that you're grasping. So just quickly describe this and then we'll move on to the next image.
Sure. What I'm holding is a section of the silk organza photograph, and I'm lifting it off of the photograph that's printed on the flashing tape substrate.
Mm-hmm.
I'm doing that for the detail because these works are entered into exhibits, and I need to visually show that this is a movable section. All the strips are only attached at the top.
Yeah.
So when you walk by the piece, if there's air stirring, it'll flutter.
Oh, great. If you've never heard or if you've never seen the work of Eva Hesse, a German artist who was very prominent in the 70s, you might want to look at her work because she uses that flexible fabric, fluttering in the breeze, even in a gallery space in a very effective way. So, well, thank you. Let's go on because I really want everybody to see all the images that you selected.
Okay, another fairly recent piece. Now, there is a story behind this one, Will, if you can bear with me. You can see that they're squares, essentially. The mount is squares. That's been quilted and painted. And that used to be another piece. So what happens I don't know if this happens as much in the art world, but unfortunately, pieces age out. And then I get bored with the piece as well.
Mhm.
So I'm exploring ways of revitalizing older works. So this piece was formerly called Flown, and I painted it, and then I decided to collage an image on top. And the image itself is printed on cotton broadcloth, and then that is collaged as well with painted fabrics, painted silk organza generally, because I love silk organza. That's one of my favorite fabrics. And I had to so I printed that as large as possible, and then I stitched the text that you might be able to see on the top third of the interior image. And because the background, the mount now, formerly a work, is divided into squares, I had to divide that quilted piece into squares, or not squares, but to fit within those segments where I wanted it to be mounted. And then that is tied on. So if I had a digital detail, you would see that the whole piece has a lot of black ties that are just kind of sticking out of the piece. I call it Jerding's end because if you look at the bottom half of the boat, there's this black area. That's a big old hole in the boat. And it sits out. I live on a lake now, and it sits out on one of the coves. Excuse me. And they let the water out in the lake so that people don't have to bring in their docks, and then the ice won't take them off. So this was taken when the water was low. So when the water's at its regular summer level, you can only see the top of the boat. So we called it Journey's End because obviously it's not going anywhere.
Well, just for clarity and so that I think I can dig a little deeper myself into appreciating the work, those black lines that look almost like they're cracks or thin branches, that's the fibers that you're talking about.
Those are the quilting lines.
They move freely or not?
Yes, I can fold this up to the size of one of those squares.
Oh, okay. And then the text, I don't know if it's simply because this is an image that's on my computer screen or not. Could a viewer standing in front of the actual object read the text?
Yes.
What is the text, and is the text chosen to complement or amplify the image?
The text says, and it's a quote from Ansel Adams, you don't take a photograph with just a camera. You bring to the act all of the pictures you have seen, all of the books you have read, the music you have heard, and the people you have loved.
Excellent. That's so appropriate for this image. And, you know, Adams, his life and career overlapped Whistler, James Abbott McNeill Whistler, the great American painter, and he defended himself in a slander suit with an answer that was essentially the same, you know, and if you know,
that's your art background. You're you're an art historian. So obviously, no juicy tidbits.
Well, I always find it interesting when I speak to an artist like yourself. You're really doing very accomplished work here, and you're often saying things and doing things that are so similar to what these quote unquote famous artists have done and said. And that's one of the things that I find most rewarding about being now in this phase of my life involved with artists directly. There are so many wonderfully talented people that the art world that I had my professional career in never even heard about, and probably would be dismissive of. But, you know, there are people like you out there who are doing really wonderful things without any of that formal training that I had in any field. So let's go on and share some more of that with the next image, please. This is a beautiful piece, just plain beautiful.
Thank you so much. This is a relatively simple piece to create. It's made, I printed this particular piece on commercially prepared inkjet fabric. The photograph itself is a combination between obviously trees out in my yard during probably sunset, because I'm never up early enough for sunrise. An office window. So the dividing window between the waiting room and the receptionist was this frosted window with all these leaves just kind of embedded in there. And I thought it was so beautiful. And I took a picture of it. And this is what I used to create that particular image. So you never know where you're going to see imagery or that inspires you. And today, where you don't have to worry about how much memory card you have left or how much film you got in your bag, you can take pictures, a lot of different kinds of pictures. And I suggest that you do that, that if at any time when you double take something or you pause to look at something, that's when you should take a picture.
Yep.
Because that's yourself saying,
Yep.
hey, look at that. This is meaningful for you. At
Yep,
least
I agree 100%, 100%. I'm sure you've had the experience I've had. You, for some reason, rush on by and don't do that. And then you think about that image and how much you wish you had captured it and you could keep it and use it later. You said this was a fairly simple piece, and I think you meant materially. So this is a photograph on fabric, and it's like you've stitched with black thread the leaves that you see, almost like quilting stitching.
It is quilting.
Okay, it literally is quilting.
It's not traditional quilting. It's artistic quilting, or drawing with thread, some people will call it.
Yeah, and is this a technique, a process that you would explain and maybe even illustrate in your upcoming book?
No, this is more from my first book.
Oh, okay. Okay, because this is some of the work that that we've looked at. It's the complexity of the use of materials that makes it beautiful and visually appealing. But this is so straightforward. What is it that's pushing you to go beyond this stage to where you are now? What was it that you were reaching for as you became technically more complex?
It's just artistic growth. I don't think the technical aspect is growing as much as my desire to work with substrates that are non-traditional. So that I don't want to go to the store, Epson store, and buy glossy G-clay canvas and print my photographs out ad nauseum to hang in a show. I think that's, to me, that's flat. It's what can I say, boring. I just really like the exploration of trying things. And right now the new book is again, the working title is something like expressing with collage, combining fiber, paper, and photography. And
Well,
that's what it's so much fun. It's because, so you can take the same photograph, you can make 10 different substrates, print the same photograph on all of those, and they'll each be individually different. They'll each have their own spark.
Yes.
And in fact, I do that sometimes when I'm working for a larger piece. So I usually work 6x6, 12x12, and then I work with larger exhibit pieces. And when I do a large piece, I make a small substrate of the same substrate that I'm going to make the larger piece out of, to experiment first on a smaller piece, because I've had the experience of printing a large piece on a created substrate and not liking it.
Yeah.
Now there are fixes for that, but yeah. So now I do try to make a couple sample pieces of the same substrate, and I have some new substrates that'll be in the new book that I'd like to say I invented since then, but I really can't share that right now.
Yeah. Well, I think I feel like I really understand on a deeper level why you're doing what you're doing, because I often print my photographs. I'll do a color version, I'll do a black and white version. I'll use Photoshop or Lightroom to, play with contrast or play with color. And another thing I like to do is print on watercolor paper. Because you can have all those different textures, and sometimes I'll print and exhibit a piece on watercolor paper, and someone will say, well, I thought that was a painting. It looks like a painting. How did you do that? And so I see exactly, and I've experienced what you're saying, the different substrates and the different materials give you a different outcome. It's a unique work of art. And I feel like I kind of had a breakthrough recently by doing a landscape on watercolor paper, and I thought when it came out of the printer that looks like a painting, and I went back to the computer and played with it a little more and got something that I know I'd never been able to do before, and it just got accepted in a pretty substantial exhibit. So, you know, I really, what you're doing now, I think I understand how really creative and at what a level of creativity is involved in what you're doing. So let's look at the next slide. I really am fascinated. I want to know more about what are those objects and what are those little strips of that look like paper.
All right, so this is a process piece in that I printed the background to this a couple years ago, and the background is a puddle. When you drop a stone in water and it ripples out, and you kind of see that sort of dead center. There's a rippling going on. So that was printed on canvas, and I really liked it, but it wasn't quite enough to complete. I didn't feel. Anyway, so then later on, as I'm working, I had this photograph that I took of a still life on my, I don't know, shelf or something. And I had played with it and desaturated it. And I just happened to place it on top of that piece. And I thought, oh, look at that. So what this is essentially is, instead of being manipulated in Photoshop, this is two photographs placed on top of each other, creating the illusion of a layered photograph from Photoshop. But it's so the canvas photo underneath with the puddle, and then the top photograph was printed on digitally prepared silk organza. And when I put it on the piece and I started stitching with it, I didn't quite like the top of the organza photograph. So I was a little frustrated. So I started tearing it. And then for another piece. And then I said, oh, this is fun. And I kept tearing. And then I said, I like the way that the organza is just flopping down on the rest of it. It adds a whole nother textural element to it. So the stitching echoes, there's wrinkling on top of the canvas photo, canvas printed photograph. And then that white sort of flaky stuff is opaque flake medium that you can buy. It's a commercial product. And I've been experimenting with different specialty mediums since probably the late 90s, because I used to do a lot of mixed media work before my digital explosion. So
the still life is not something that in and of itself satisfied you as a work of art. And it looks like it's like an apple and a lemon and maybe a plum or something. So
pottery.
It's pottery. Okay. So it's the shapes and the textures that are significant. It's not what those objects are or any of that. That's
right. And I named it Still Over Water because even though the water shows movement, it's a still life. So it's a still, and it's over the water. So it's actually a description of how I put it together.
Well, this is maybe a kind of a quirky question because I go through New Hampshire most summers on the way to and from Maine. So you belong to the League of New Hampshire Craftsmen, right?
I do, yes.
And you exhibit with them regularly?
I exhibit every year. I submit a couple pieces to the Living with Crafts, which is now art, design, and craft exhibit. But I used to do craft booths, and I would do the Sunapee Fair with the craft booth, and I did Craft Boston and Paradise City. And that grew very old after 6 years, because when you go to a craft fair, if I could just put a plug in for those artists, you're taking 9 panels of 30-inch wide by 6 feet or higher panels into that and constructing them. And then you have to consider lighting, and then you sit there with the artwork. And it was a wonderful experience. I loved interacting with the people because they would come in and I would tell them the stories behind the work. And oftentimes I didn't realize the stories behind the work until I explained them. If that sounds counterintuitive, but that's what happened. And that was great. But physically, I'm just not up to doing that craft booth gig anymore. But it was fun while it lasted. And I'm in their galleries, the different, mostly the Concord Gallery. I was in Hanover. They have like, I don't know, 9 different galleries throughout the city.
Mhm. Well, when I did that craft fair art show thing once in Lovell, Maine, and we're about the same age, but I've tried to stay very fit, and I decided all of that hauling around and setting up and everything was just what you said. There was a little too much of that, but I love the conversations. But here's my real question about the craftsmen, the League of New Hampshire Craftsmen. So many of them are more conventional than you are. Do you feel that at all?
Yes, well, here's why. The Crafts League was founded originally during the craft movement of the 40s and 50s, I think, maybe even before that. So it's rooted in traditional crafts, but it is and accepting more contemporary art forms. That said, when I was first joined into it in 1993, I was doing I was painting my fabrics and making what I called fiber art constructions by cutting and piecing without patterns. I just would cut them and put them together. And that's how I got into the league. I also did artware for a period of years, like 10 years. And that was wonderful as well. But all of a sudden I was sewing a jacket and I said, that's it. I can't do it anymore.
Yeah.
I jacket in pieces that I was working on, and someday I'll finish it, but I just
Well, I'm glad they've welcomed you. They do have an exceedingly high standard for what one would normally call craft, but I'm glad, and I have seen it at their gallery in North Conway in the last few years, that they're broadening out and they're accepting some more contemporary elements. I think we have one more image, don't we, Marissa? Because we're running out of time now. I want to leave time for questions. So what I'm going to do so that we can share them all is when I'm not going to ask questions unless I can't hold my tongue. So just explain the title and the process as quickly as you can so we can get through all 3.
Sure. This is a very brand new, spanking new piece, and it's gone through a couple configurations. I played around with creating handmade paper, which was then dipped in indigo dye, which is on the right and left of the center image. And they are hand sewn together with hand dyed pearl cotton. The image in the center is an unmanipulated image that I took of a shadow on the wall. And that's been quilted and cut apart and resewn back together again. And I call it the ties that bind. The image in the center was printed on, let me think, canvas.
Next image, yeah. Is this an Edward Curtis photograph originally?
So it's a copyright-free photograph from Edward Curtis that I found on the internet. And I created this piece. I belong to the Studio Art Quilts Association, and they had a call for a jury about immigration. And I made this piece because I called it Broken in Pieces, but then I decided it should have its native name, which is in Cherokee, which I will not try to. If anybody knows how to say it properly, I won't dishonor it by mispronouncing it. Anyway, the piece is printed on interfacing, which I painted black, and then I applied a layer of molding paste. And this is in my first book. I also have a DVD workshop, which may still be available through Interweave, about textured photography. And I worked with this technique for some time because I really enjoy it and I go back to it every once in a while. But the piece itself was printed after it was prepared with digital non-porous ink aid. And I printed as large as I can. And then I decided to cut it up because of the title that I originally had, called Broken in Pieces. And it represents the Trail of Tears that the Native Americans were subjected to, and how it broke up their culture.
That's an image, of course, that I'm very familiar with as both a historian of American art and as a photographer. And I think your use of that image and your techniques really does create something that is compelling and sort of reinterprets, reimagines that
Yeah,
whole.
I did edit it a little bit. I did edit the image slightly. I didn't want to completely just use an unaltered image. So the coloring is definitely been altered, and the presentation has been altered. And there's a little, the X's, they were sewn onto the background image, which is painted interfacing because of the crossing out of their culture.
Yeah. Well, very, very fascinating, very compelling work. So one more. I have to stop myself. Go ahead, please.
Okay. This is an old friend. I've had this piece, it's for a while, and it's been around the block. It's been to Fuller Craft Museum. It was accepted in the Sakwa's sofa exhibit in Chicago, which unfortunately was canceled this year. This particular piece uses the same exact photograph for all of the different panels. And the reason they present differently, excuse me, is it was an experimental piece to explore Photoshop. At the time, I was learning how to manipulate photographs. So each piece was blended with a photograph of my painted fiber or my painted fabric work. And then after I made several of these images, I selected the ones that I thought would go together to create a kind of a charm piece. And why do I call it charm piece? At the time, I was also exploring commercially prepared digital fabric. So these are all silk. The whole thing, silk fabrics, different silk fabrics, though. There's silk broadcloth and Fuji silk and China silk and so on and so forth. And then at the time, this is the beginning of a series that I call segmented quilt presentation. Why do I call it that? Is because it's a nod to traditional quilts, which are generally in some sort of square configuration, but these it undulates. They're only attached at each corner and in the middle. And because they were put together this way, traditional quilts are bound. They have a fabric border. And I decided that would be ungainly and not very pleasurable to look at. So what I did was I edge stitched each one of these after I quilted them and sealed the edges with silver paint. So the silver paint did a couple things. It edged the work nicely, it sort of frames it. It also seals the edges so that they don't ravel, because the paint is essentially a plastic acrylic. I don't use anything that's not washable. What was the other reason? Oh, it colored the edges so you couldn't see the batting. And then I tied them together. And now I continue, no matter what kind of presentation I'm working with, I generally will paint the edges. And I was so careful at the time not to get the paint on the front. And now I like it. It undulates.
Well, it's a really beautiful and appealing piece. And all of your work is appealing in its own way, and sometimes in multiple ways, of course. I really do appreciate you taking the time to share your work and to explain it, because it's not what we're most familiar with, most of us. And I think knowing how inventive you've been in using your materials is part of what is impressive about what your body of work that we've looked at. So we just have a few minutes. We're pretty punctual about recognizing this is the dinner hour or the cocktail hour, but we can probably squeeze in a couple of quick questions. So raise your hand and Marissa will see that and admit you to ask your question.
There are several comments as well in the chat. I apologize in advance if I pronounce any names incorrect. So regarding the first image that was shared, Elaine was wondering what was the paper that you used? This one, Drawing a Breath.
Okay, there's no paper. So the top, it's 2 layers. The top layer is printed on a digital silk organza. The bottom layer is printed on a combination, excuse me, of flashing tape and duct tape, which I adhere to interfacing. And then I apply digital grounds.
Okay.
I love that you used duct tape. Now I know duct tape can be used for anything.
Yeah, it's fun to iron too.
Yeah.
'Cause I had to.
Marissa, are there any more
Yeah,
questions?
Yeah,
in the
there are
comment?
more questions. There are several compliments, just people admiring your work, loving your approach and experimentation. They love how creative you are. Elaine
We
also
can
has-
share those congratulatory, and I saw them as they came up, and they're all well deserved and very appropriate,
Yes,
very apt.
absolutely.
Let's see if we can get 1 or 2 more of the questions that came through the
Okay.
comment or chat.
Yes. Elaine also was curious about, so she says your stitches are very regular, which probably goes to your quilting expertise, but are they sewn by hand or machine?
Okay, Parting in the Mist was sewn by machine. And
Okay.
yeah, that's kind of a thing I have about quilting. Back in the 80s, we did a splinter off group from that guild that I told you about called the Renegades, because at that time they didn't accept machine quilting.
Oh.
But now we're all returning back to hand stitching, but the freedom of the hand stitching is what I want to embrace. And I've been experimenting more with that. And I did add some hand stitching in the piece with the boat, Journey's End.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Maybe 1 more.
There are no more questions in the comments, but if someone would like to unmute and ask a question, please feel free to.
Yeah, 1 more.
Come on, give me it to me.
Okay, well, there was a whole lot of beautiful work and a whole lot of fascinating ideas. And of course, your media and your techniques are quite complex. So there was really a lot to digest. But I think that this is one of the most rewarding conversations I've had in the series of Wil Talks. And I really do, Wen, thank you for your work and for sharing it with us tonight. And thanks to all of you for listening in. And Marissa, thanks for your help as usual. So good night all, and we'll see you in a few weeks.
All right, you all have a good night. Thank you so much. And thank you again, Wen and Wil.
Hey, everyone, thank you for
Night.
coming.
Bye.
All right.